Okay, well, thank you, Angie, and thanks for the invite to be here. It's a great forum. I do apologize in advance. I've been spending this week fighting off a cold, so if I don't come across clear, I'm not contagious anymore. Yeah. I won't. That's why I'm going to stay up here. If I'm not clear or if I'm not making sense, please stop and I'll clarify. I am on some pretty heavy cold meds. So as Angie said, I am a part of the Ernst & Young's CCAS team, which is Climate Change and Sustainability Services. Most people don't know we exist, but we are a small team within this bigger accounting firm. And so E&Y is one of the big four global public accounting firms. And within that firm, we have a small team of non-accountants. So I'm not an accountant, but we have a small team of multidisciplinary professionals that deal with all kinds of matters related to ESG, sustainability, environmental, health and safety systems and processes. So kind of from start to finish, soup to nuts, we deal with anything that touches on environment, climate change, sustainability. So that's our team. And I'm going to talk to you guys today about kind of what we're seeing in terms of the market and what we're seeing in our clients around ESG. Talk to you about some of the challenges that they're encountering, and maybe end with some questions as to where we think this will go and what some further developments might be. So in terms of an agenda, I'm just really going to introduce ESG at a high level. I'll talk about why companies should care about ESG. Talk about how it's being reported. We'll get into then who's interested in this in terms of the reports that companies are disclosing. And then I'll get into where you can start a conversation in your organization on ESG. And then I'll just end with some final thoughts and have a discussion period. Don't worry about taking notes. I think this is going to be shared, Angie. So some of the key takeaways I would like to just make sure that we imprint on you before you leave is that companies aren't immune to ESG risks, and these risks are only going to get more acute as time goes on. ESG factors are material to companies' credit ratings and to their ability to access capital. And so the company's governance of ESG risks and issues is what's going to determine leaders from laggards as we move forward. In terms of ESG, so I gather most of us have heard the term ESG. So ESG really is those matters that come under the categories of environmental, social, and governance that have a material impact on companies' performance in the short term and in the long term, and also on their valuation. And so under the ESG categories, we see things such as climate change and carbon emissions, climate resilience and adaptation. Under social, we see issues such as labor relations, diversity agenda, and obviously board diversity, board oversight are some of the key governance issues and topics. And so one of the things that I am careful of is distinguishing between ESG and sustainability. And so while I don't want to say that they're completely separate, there are some overlaps, but they're not quite the same thing. First of all, I think that sustainability is kind of this notion of doing well by doing good that we're all kind of familiar with. Has to do with companies talking a lot about what they're doing in terms of corporate social responsibility, engagement with community, and we've all seen kind of the sustainability reports that companies issue on an annual basis that kind of talk about the great things that they're doing. ESG is slightly different. ESG comes from the kind of the investor and capital markets side of things, and ESG really refers to really hardcore metrics that investors are using to identify superior returns based on companies' awareness and management of ESG risks. So although there are similarities, when we talk about ESG and sustainability, they're not quite the same thing. And you can see this when you compare reports, sustainability reports and ESG reports. They're really directed at different audiences and they have slightly different content. I would say in terms of the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen this huge increase in the attention put on ESG by companies, by investors, by stakeholders. And there's a lot of macro external factors that play into this and create this rise in prominence of ESG. So external factors such as multinational drivers, regulation, stakeholder expectations of company performance. There's also industry developments, so companies seeing that acknowledging and managing ESG risks is good business practice. We've seen a broader interpretation of fiduciary duty to include these longer-term drivers that ESG encompasses, and we've seen a growth of investor-driven ESG initiatives. And increasingly, I think there's anecdotally and also from academia, there's evidence that there is a connection between good performance and long-term value and management of ESG risks and opportunities. And so this is really the trajectory of how we've gotten to where we are in the past few years. So it's by no means a new thing. It's been around for well over 10 years, but really I think the attention that we've seen is really in the last few years as companies have transitioned from the sustainability mindset to more of an ESG mindset. And we're certainly seeing this in the market and in terms of our clients. There's a huge demand on ESG, trying to kind of interpret what it means for companies and respond to investor inquiries. In terms of why companies should care about ESG, obviously all the issues that come under the ES and the G compartments all have to do with, or most of them have to do with performance. And in the long run, I think ESG speaks to risk management, and also capitalizing on opportunities. And so, a lot of these ESG issues have become critical business issues. And so what we're seeing is that, things like political pressure, market pressure, investor pressure, all of these are creating some really salient risks that need to be managed, and they're also creating some opportunities for companies that are proactive in managing these to capture some value in the short and the long term. So obviously ESG, I think, is tied to a larger issue of enterprise risk management. Obviously, managing your ESG risk is a critical component of long-term value creation. Investors they want to know that companies are aware of their risks and they're managing them and mitigating them as best they can. And so some examples of typical ESG risks that we see are climate change, carbon emissions, extreme weather-related catastrophes, labor relations diversity, and board diversity, corruption, and bribery. So all of these things present risks that need to be managed and mitigated in order to create long-term value and capture opportunities. Interestingly enough, we are seeing that the evidence in practice is pointing to the fact that companies that manage their ESG issues are creating value in the short and long term. So very recently, EY published a report on how ESG creates long-term value, and some of the key conclusions that came up in the report, excuse me, were that first of all, ESG reduces risk and it drives value creation, and we're seeing that there's up to a 2 times return on assets that are generated when you're investing in high-performing ESG firms. The second key takeaway is that ESG is an enabler of access to capital. And so one of the studies that EY did this year found that 96% of investors say that ESG performance is important to their evaluations of companies. And finally, the third key takeaway from this report was that a lack of risk-based management around ESG and disclosure can lead to undervaluation, simply because if you're not telling your ESG story in a way that meets investors' needs, they're going to have to get that data from somewhere else, from a third-party analytics company or whatnot. So you need to really own and tell your own story in order to capture that value that is associated with your ESG initiatives. When we look at how ESG typically is reported, there's kind of 2 sides of things. There's the guidance that exists for companies to report against, and there's the ratings agencies that rate the ESG disclosures. So when we look at what's available for companies to look at in terms of creating an ESG disclosure, there's various standards that are promulgated by SASB, TCFD, GRI, NASDAQ, and so all of these provide suggestions as to what they think are material topics based on a company's industry sector. And part of the challenge of evaluating ESG disclosures is that there are a lot of standards that companies can use. And so part of the challenge is that this whole landscape is not consistent. There's different guidelines, different standards that companies can adopt. And on the other side, we see that there's a lot of different rating agencies that use their own ratings approaches and models to evaluate companies' ESG disclosures. So rating agencies such as MSCI, Sustainalytics, CDP, DJSI, all of these apply their own internal methods to rate companies' performance, and they provide, I think at a fee, they provide analytics around various ESG metrics that companies do disclose. So all that to say that in terms of corporate ESG disclosures, they are evolving. I mean, it's not an exact science. There's no cookie cutter approach that we can apply to clients that want to disclose ESG performance. And in fact, one of the key reports that came out this year from TCFD was their annual status report. For the key takeaways that I found were quite interesting is that climate-related financial information is still insufficient in terms of the quality of information being presented. It's insufficient for investors to make informed decisions. Investors also need more clarity on the potential financial impact of climate-related issues on their companies. And so when companies are talking about climate change, they're not doing so in a way that gives concrete, quantitative metrics that allow people to assess the risks of climate change to their business. Finally, although companies are increasingly using scenario analysis, most don't disclose information on the resilience of their strategies. So it's one thing to say we do scenario analysis. It's quite another to say what's the actual impact on our business. And obviously, climate-related functions, ESG disclosure requires multiple levels of an organization. And so far, we've seen that usually it's kind of taken up by the investor relations or the sustainability group of a company. And so we're not seeing that integration from top of the house to the bottom of the house that we need to. So all that to say that the TCFD report says that although ESG disclosures are increasing, they're still insufficient in terms of being able to make quality decisions. They're lacking consistency, partly because of the different guidelines and different approaches that companies can use to report. And there's still too few. So we're not seeing as many companies publish ESG reports as we are seeing sustainability reports. So I know a lot of companies are transitioning from sustainability reporting to ESG reporting, but it's still, we don't have the number and quantity that we do in the sustainability report world. So those are some of the challenges associated with ESG disclosures that we've seen. In terms of who's interested in ESG performance, obviously companies of all sizes are. It's certainly hit the spotlight in the last few years. We've seen that a lot of our clients are coming to us with a lot of questions around ESG disclosure, ESG performance, ESG strategy. And we because we're a global firm, we do work with everything from large to very small clients. And without variation, a lot of the questions that we get are around these. The clients come to us with, they're getting questions from investors. They're having mergers and acquisition activity that requires them to kind of get their ESG ducks in a row, stakeholder reporting responsibilities, maybe a change in strategy. So these are kind of the drivers that clients come to us with in terms of help us interpret this ESG obligation or this expectation that we have. And so that struggle is kind of, obviously clients want to be competitive, they want to maintain, add value, they want to access capital, but there's a whole host of issues that present challenges to clients that come to us. And again, this goes back to a lot of the discussion around reporting. What guidelines, what standards do we use? How and what rating agencies are using our disclosures. So a lot of this has to do with kind of navigating that expectation from investors, but also the plethora of different approaches and standards that companies can use to report. So without question, companies are interested in ESG, but there's also that huge barrier of there's a lot of uncertainties, there's a lot of questions around ESG that we're having to help them navigate and answer. On the other side of things, obviously investors are very interested in ESG. So this is from a study that EY again did this year. And again, I'll share this deck so that you guys can have the links. But obviously investors want to know that companies are avoiding and managing long-term risks around ESG. Companies obviously want to create value and competitive advantage by managing their ESG risks. So some of the interesting things that a recent report found were that 97% of investors say they do conduct an evaluation of companies' non-financial disclosures. 96% of them have said that in the past 12 months, ESG has factored into their decision making. Interestingly enough, 91% have said that although the status of their reports is improving, there's still a lot of information that needs to be refined. But all that to say that at the end of the day, I think ESG considerations are now a really accepted and expected input to investment decisions. So companies need to be aware of this, need to manage around it. Interesting enough, that same study that we did earlier this year identified that ESG and governance, climate change issues are some of the ones that have jumped the most in terms of being prominent ones that investors use to make decisions on. So very specifically, risk of poor governance practices, risk in supply chain, and risk from climate change have had huge jumps in the last 2 years, from 2017 to 2018, in terms of the prominence of those factors in making investment decisions. Some of the questions that we're seeing or that clients are coming to us with are listed here. I'm not going to read them out, but you can see that investors are getting quite sophisticated. They're getting quite direct, and they're approaching companies very directly with questions around their ESG management. We find that it's not enough now to say that you're a small company or that you're going to fly under the radar. We find that investors are getting quite activist around targeting companies that they want to invest in and asking them very pointed questions around their performance. And so this is something that I think is going to increase. And I also think that whereas companies, 5-6 years ago could maybe say, we're a smaller producer, this doesn't really apply to us, or we've got management systems in place, they're now being expected to be very explicit, very transparent about what they're doing in terms of ESG. In terms of where to start an ESG conversation in your organization, here are some suggested questions that we typically ask of our clients and we share with our clients. They're targeted typically at the senior levels of an organization, simply because that's kind of where inquiries come to, and that's where the conversation, I think, needs to start in terms of setting that culture for ESG in the organization. But typically, there are questions that are typically directed to the board, the CEO, the CFO, the CRO, and the COO, and they all have to do kind of around risk and operationalizing ESG and how you're managing the risks and what's your exposure to these. So again, I'll share these just so that you can have these in mind if you do want to kind of take these into your organizations and start that discussion with your leadership. Just to close off with some thoughts, although I think ESG as a natural progression from sustainability reporting has come a long way in the past few years, I think there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. The key message is that investors are getting more sophisticated and they're getting more demanding in companies reporting on non-financial assets, risks, and opportunities. I think companies need to build that strategic story about how they're managing this, how they're using their management, integrating that into a ESG strategy, and then capturing any opportunities that arise from this ESG. And I'll just close with some questions that I think are quite pertinent to this conversation as we move ahead, because I think from the practitioner side, from the reporter side, from the evaluator side, we're all kind of evolving as we work through this. The integration of ESG into corporate strategy and enterprise risk management. We see a lot of focus on the reporting side, but I think reporting is a small element or a lesser function of a larger strategy. And that strategy, to have value, needs to be integrated into your corporate strategy so that it's not a standalone function. What should be included in the S? So Laurie's going to speak to this, but one of the big gray areas we see that companies are struggling with, and to admit, we're struggling with is how do you define the S for your organization? What's included in that? I mean, it can, just looking at it, some of the metrics under the S bucket are quite vague, but again, how can companies make the most of the issues under that S category and make it real and relevant to them? I think the E and the G side of things we have a bit more experience with. There's more concrete numbers that we can put around those, but the S has always been kind of the big question mark, the big elephant in the room. Consistent ESG reporting and communication. Again, this goes back to the plethora of different standards, guidelines, approaches that companies can use. How do you make sense of it all? How do you either combine them or rationalize them so that you have a single consistent approach that both reporters can use and evaluators can use to generate some meaningful data? A question, how do you integrate all functions of a business into ESG and the management of it? So typically, as I alluded to, ESG is taken up by either your sustainability group, corporate responsibility group, or sometimes your investor relations group. But what we're seeing is that the issues that come under ESG are so long-term, and they're very often enterprise-wide, that it doesn't make sense to have a small department kind of manage this. So it does need to involve kind of the top of the house to the bottom, and it needs to start with that senior leadership at the top. Finally, standardization or consolidation of guidelines and ratings approaches, I think, would go a long way in providing that consistency, providing that comparability between disclosures and reporting approaches. So I'll end on that. I hope that's been useful in kind of setting the stage in terms of what ESG is and how we've kind of got to where it's become quite a focus these days. We're certainly seeing a lot in the Calgary market in terms of the last 6 months. It's been almost an explosion of ESG questions that we're getting from traditionally companies that wouldn't have thought about this or wouldn't have really put a lot of time and effort into it. So we're seeing a lot of the small to medium-sized companies come to us with questions around ESG because they're getting questions from investors. The big players, obviously, they have a good handle on this. They've got experience with it, but there's also a learning curve for them. But we're definitely seeing a huge explosion in ESG in the topic, and there's still a lot of room for evolution. And as much as it's a bit of a science, it's also a bit of an art too. So there's still a lot of evolution that needs to happen in terms of getting us to where we need to be. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I don't know if this mic is working, but...
the mic is actually more for the video.
Oh, it's more for the videoing. Okay, very good, excellent. Now, we have a very interesting group of people here, and I'm just curious, how many of you work in organizations where ESG is part of the conversation? Just a show of hands, a few. Okay, that's great. How many of you are here just because you're interested to understand what's going on with ESG? Most people are just interested. Okay. Well, I want to give a little bit of a context on who I am and the nature of my business, which I think will help you understand my perspective a little bit further. So I've started Synesis. It's my own company about 15 years ago, and I work primarily in the intermediate energy space. So that's the context that I'm coming from and can give you some perspectives on. Of course, intermediate energy in Calgary seems to be sort of at the forefront and heart of the downtown sphere. But recognizing that it's a very narrow line of sight into ESG. That said, it's also a really challenging area for ESG, and I think if you're looking at how to start that conversation, if you can get that started in intermediate energy, it doesn't matter what other organization you're dealing with, you're going to see some success as well. In 15 years, the energy space has changed so much, and the evolution has changed so much. And I really appreciate Hans setting the context so that we have a common language and a common vocabulary around what ESG is and so on. When I graduated from university in 1993, the notion we called triple bottom line was a really core topic in business school. Of course, I'm a chartered accountant, and I have a Bachelor of Commerce degree. And so that was really an important conversation. And we're seeing how the ESG has evolved from that triple bottom line concept, which didn't get a lot of traction. It was experimented with, but then moved into this notion of sustainability reporting. And so that has taken, almost 25 odd years to get some traction and see where we're going. 25 years. In 15 years, we're seeing a lot of change in Calgary occur. And that change really has happened, I would say, in the last 3 years. It's very recent and exactly echoing very much what Hans is seeing. Within the energy context and what we're looking at in terms of ESG being impactful and seeing change, what I do want to encourage you and give you some hope around is that there is actual movement. And I want to speak to some examples. I want to share with you some of the challenges that these companies are facing and to give a context about how not only to engage, but to help you understand the journey that your organization will take. Or if you're interested in organizations, maybe give you a bit more empathy or some tools to understand how to have that conversation with organizations where you're seeing maybe that pace of adoption and change not occur as quickly. So that's what I want to leave with you. When I started 15 years ago in intermediate energy, the focus was deal making. The line of sight and time horizon for businesses was a very short horizon. When you're looking at an organization where the executive team has maybe a 2 to 3 year lifespan, it's really hard to get excited and move any traction or the dial on ESG because it's a hot potato game. I might have some assets that require a lot of reclamation, but I'm not going to keep it. Toss it to the next person who acquires, and so on and so on and so on. From an environmental perspective, there wasn't a need for strategy because the line of sight or the horizon for the length of the company's lifespan was very short. Those days are ended, they've ended, they're done. And now organizations have to really consider sustainability in a brand new way. And they didn't enter that space with those types of skill sets. And so this is part of the reason adoption and impact has taken quite some time, because it does require a mindset, it does require skill sets. In 15 years, what I've really noticed, and I'm going to speak to each of the ESG elements, how things have really evolved. I want to start a little bit with on the social side. So we talk a little bit about governance, because social being sort of one of those underrated in the three letters. I would go to board meetings for my clients, attend board meetings, audit committee meetings, and I was the only female. And that was the reality probably for 12 years. And we're seeing real impact as there's a drive to include more women on boards and to prepare for women on boards, promote more females into executive positions. This drive in sustainability, or in the ESG element, is actually making tangible movements and changes right here in our city. I'm no longer the only female. When I just got out of Q3 board meetings and audit committee meetings, and I wasn't the only female there. There were a large number of board members. And in fact, for one of my clients, they first appointed the first female chairman of the board, which is very exciting. So these types of expectations and conscientiousness, while they may not be reporting specifically, there's an awareness around it. It's moving the dial on the governance component in diversity. There's still a lot of way to go. I don't want to say it's perfect and we've arrived, but we've seen the dial move tangibly. Ethics. Ethics is a really big piece, and I'll tell you what I'm seeing also change in organizations from a governance perspective. In the field and the way that contracts are awarded, and I mean this is a very significant part of the governance element, is that few people held a lot of power to award contracts. What happens when you have absolute power? Absolute corruption. And so there was a huge element across Canada where production is occurring. So across Canada, that's basically from Alberta, BC, and south of the border that way in those areas. The rural communities where contracts were being awarded, there was probably kickbacks occurring. There was probably overstatement of services, falsification of invoices. Why am I saying probably? Because I saw these in whistleblower complaints. They would come through, I would have to do investigations on this, and then talk to the organizations about how are you going to address this. We're getting a lot of concerns around conflicts of interest. We're getting a lot of concerns around fraudulent activity that's occurring. What are we going to do about this? Previously, these kinds of things actually didn't even want them to be investigated. They just wanted to move it aside. But now, not only investigating, there's a growing interest in resolving them. And do you know why that there's a heightened interest in resolving these governance issues? Women on boards, that could be part of it. But because right now, companies need to run their businesses very successfully. Cost control is so important. If you are wasting your money through fraudulent spending, you don't have that money anymore. Access to capital is so difficult. So actually, organizations are becoming more responsible because they need the funds to execute their business. It makes good business sense. And that's the part for me that I think is really inspiring, because they're doing these things not because there's a social movement requiring them to do them. They're doing the right things because it's good business sense to do them. It reinforces that. And to me, that's a very hope-filled item. What I can honestly say that I'm seeing that's tangibly moved, in intermediate energy, they never had procurement departments before. Now you're seeing supply chain teams form where it's being more professionalized. You're bringing in the right expertise. We're including segregation, collaborative teams to make the decisions that not any one person has control. This is good governance, and this is good business sense. So we're seeing the dial move in the energy space in that area. I'm also seeing, I just want to speak a little bit more on now some of the environmental elements as well. And the energy industry, of course, there's a growing disenchantment with Canadian energy in global investors and institutional investors. And if it's because of an environmental bias, believing that the energy space is not a good industry to invest in, or whatever the case may be, capital is leaving. And yet at the same time, in Canada, what I find really fascinating is that we have some of the highest environmental standards, and how it doesn't matter the size of your organization. You could be a large global multinational like a Shell or a BP, to some of the smaller intermediate junior companies. They all have to comply with the same regulations, which around the globe are the highest and most rigorous. And that's something I think that we need to be very proud of as not only Calgarians and Canadians, but also really supportive of for our energy space. And what we're seeing is that, again, based on business reasoning, and which again I think really further reinforces why ESG is important, but also it's being done for the right reasons, not for a paper exercise, is that a number of my clients are taking a look at how they're handling water and recycling it. And they're doing this because it saves them money. Companies are evaluated not only on ESG, but also on bottom line. There are metrics that are dollar-related metrics that are also important to investors. Because at the end of the day, you might meet full marks on ESG, but if you're not making money, you're not going to, it might be, that's great, we love what you're doing, but at the end of the day, shareholders want returns. And regardless of the size of the return, they want returns nonetheless. And so one of my clients, Tourmaline, is one of the first to adopt this massive recycling program with their water. And you know what? It reduced their operating costs per BOE dramatically, and it was a huge differentiator for this organization. So we're seeing that type of thing occur. So I think what I'm wanting to leave in terms of the context for your organization is that you need to make sure that as a leadership team, you really understand the real drivers behind your business and really look to understand which of those drivers will give you a bit of a competitive advantage, and how do you work and make good sense leveraging whether it's an ESG element. I would say that historically, based on the expertise of the leadership team, board, and executive teams, ESG was not part of the conversation at all. It did not enter one agenda in the boardroom or at the board table when the directors sat there. Now it's becoming part of the conversation more and more. I did an extensive survey, actually, that was and an assessment that was included in a sustainability report for one of my clients. And they had a long ways to go. There were a lot of report findings, in particular what the nature of their strategy was. But they received that feedback. And in 1 year, they remediated all of those gaps that I identified, because there was such a commitment to say, we believe this could be a differentiator to help us access capital. And so I'm really excited to see that that kind of feedback is being taken and incorporated and moving the dial forward. Now, the feedback that I provided to them was, what is your strategy? Because you're doing a lot of really great things. What is your strategy? And you need to articulate and communicate that. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more these conversations at the boardroom level and with directors, is because it is a strategic conversation. You need to clearly define what the strategy is to take you where you are today to where you need to be. Now, that strategy may not change a lot of business activities, that said, because a lot of times it's saying, well, we already are doing this. And it just becomes telling the story and communicating the story. In some cases, it may mean this is something we've never thought about, And what are we going to do about it? And that's where you're going to see the dial. But I do want to leave with you the notion that even prior to having such a drive and a focus on this by institutional investors, organizations were already recognizing the value. And I think that's the place that you want to start. We all recognize there's value with this. One of my clients was sharing with me that when they have, and this was an organization that this is the first time this year, 2019, they actually had these conversations as a senior leadership team. And they had that because their investor relations, when they go speak and meet with the various institutional investors, would ask them point blank questions about what their strategies are. Specific questions that Hans shared a little bit earlier. And they didn't have answers for them. They didn't have answers because they didn't really know how to articulate or pull their thoughts together around it. And his comment was like, Lori, no, not having an answer is not an answer. It's not the answer. We need an answer to this. And I thought that was really marvelous way of shifting the mindset of the leadership teams into understanding that we have to do something about this and be very intentional. I also want to share a little bit more about on the social, and I think I gave some specific examples about that. But a lot of organizations, when they're speaking about, when you read reports that are on their sustainability reports, will focus a lot on aspects such as health and safety records. And that's really important because when you're operating a business, especially if it's in a very dangerous industry, which energy production is a very dangerous industry, that's an important element. And you'll see other measures around culture, employee engagement, perhaps even board engagement, those kinds of things, how they rank in workplace, number one workplace, or other factors like this. But I will say that in conjunction with ESG as a growing trend for leadership to work with and understand and engage with, there's another interesting trend, and that's around the role of automation. How does automation play in our opportunities as an organization to become more efficient, more environmentally friendly, more cost competitive in our cost structures? What is that looking like? And I think that most organizations are moving in that direction where they're looking at how can we start leveraging that. I'm sure you're hearing information and statistics about the importance of digitization in the energy space or in any organization, data analytics, and all of these things. And part of that conversation around automation, what AI can do for organizations, what analytics, predictive abilities, and all of this means, there's a growing factor around fear of what will this mean for my job. I'm going to also use that specifically in the energy space. How many of you here are familiar with the concept of blockchain? Most people are. So this is a really transformative tool. And in the energy space, it could actually permanently eliminate jobs. Jobs for joint venture accountants, production accountants. It will eliminate a particular type of profession. And so there's a lot of fear that's also associated with that. And when there's fear, that brings an element in on the social side of the ESG equation. And so I've been thinking about this quite a bit because I'm very much passionate about flourishing societies, and that I believe that societies that flourish have opportunities for economic autonomy, which means that every individual has an opportunity to pursue work. And if those opportunities for work do not exist, then what do you do as a society? It doesn't matter how environmental you are, if at the end of the day you can't put a roof over your head or food on the table because you have no jobs, or you become dependent on some kind of a program to just exist, is that a flourishing society? So the unique spin on the social that I have not seen this yet, and I'm using this opportunity to share this concept, to challenge your thinking about this, maybe to take this away and explore what you think you need to be doing around this area, because there are people here that are starting their careers, and this is really important for you. What does an organization's workforce demand look like? Is there an intention to have workforce? It might be fine if you have 2 employees and they're highly engaged. Does that matter? Instead, what would workforce demand look like? And so that's something that I really would like to see organizations move into, is a transparency around that, an intentionality around that, because when you consider the highest costs in G&A are your labor costs, there's a real interest in reducing the headcount. But is that the right thing for society? And this is where ESG, in my mind, is an opportunity to work with business and all stakeholders, government, business, and just broadly community, or even interested in citizens, to understand what's the right balance for our society. How will we shape that? So that's a conversation that I don't think has ever been had, but I think is one that we need to be really mindful of as well. That said, I am going to give one last kudos on the environmental side, where I see some of my clients have some real big wins. We talk about, how many of you are familiar with energy industry and what field operations are like? A few of you. Well, you know, you've probably maybe driven through Alberta and you see some pump jacks and things like that in the distance. Well, you know what? When you consider the operations of an energy company, they have people called operators that go out and drive into the field and check on each of those wells and see how they're doing and make sure that nothing blocks or stops the production, that things are working as they need to. A couple of my clients have actually implemented AI and technologies and digitization around demand work task force for operators. So historically it was left up to the operator to drive large, vast spaces. And when you're driving a big vehicle, that's a lot of emissions. Now what they've done is two things. They use drones that can check and see how things are going. And then they have daily work plans that allow these organizations to provide every day. Every operator has to check in and say, you need to go to this property, this facility, this. Do you know what that has done? That has saved this organization over $50 million. It's a permanent $50 million savings in annual operating costs. It makes sense and it's environmentally friendly. That said, they've needed fewer operators to do the work. And so there's an interesting tension. And I think when you look at ESG, there's a lot of focus right now on the E element. But I think what's going to be interesting, and I think this is where users don't just have to be institutional investors. I think all citizens should be interested in how business is functioning because it has a direct impact in their lives. Which of these is really important? How do we manage that tension with amongst the various E, S, and G elements? So anyway, those are my thoughts for the matter. I hope that was interesting and informative and inspiring for you. Thank you.
Thank you. So same thing, any kind of direct questions, and again, we'll have opportunity for more general after, but any direct questions for Lori right now? Lots to think about. Good.
Great,
So we'll
thank
bring
you.
it back up into
That's great.
Steve, come join me. We're gonna kind of for this piece, we'll specifically ask kind of a company. So Steve does a whole bunch of things, but specifically sits on the board at Vermilion Energy here in town. So when you consider Stand, I think you said you like Stand.
Pretty hyper.
There you go.
Yeah.
Which is why you do so many things.
Yeah.
But what does this look like at Vermilion? So we've kind of heard from people who consult with boards, you sit on the board. What does this look like at Vermilion?
Yeah, sure. So, 2 seconds of color. I'm a finance guy, capital markets guy. Was a senior partner at a brokerage house, and we did lots of financings and these sorts of things over the years, and have evolved my career onto the board of a couple different companies. Vermilion is the focus today. And you know, there's a lot of there's a lot of conversations at the board level, and I actually had to pen out a bit of a list here. It's an energy company. It operates in 10 different countries, roughly, land versus production and things like that. But you think about, you know, how fast is the energy transition, because that determines things like capital allocation and climate change risk. How are you going to integrate that into your decision making? You know, as there risks of floods and forest fires and those sorts of things. And, you know, you think about how do you set targets to reward the behaviors you want to see out of people rather than punish bad behavior. And that ties into all sorts of different things, safety, those sorts of ideas. We touched a little bit on diversity as well. And it's really neat to say, oh, we're going to have 30% females at the senior executive in 5 years, or whatever number you want to use. But really, it becomes within a company, it becomes how are you going to create the paths? So let's get some smart, high performance females involved, but then also make sure that they have a career path to follow such that they can, in X to Y years, get to the right place such that they're playing a role in your sustainable competitive advantage. And so those are really big questions, and I could keep going on that list, right? Like it becomes what are we talking about with the board? Like there's all that sort of stuff. And they're real questions that 5-10 years ago wouldn't have occurred in a lot of instances, right?
I'm curious, in a tough market, which we know, Alberta's tough, oil and gas is tough, nobody likes oil and gas, like there's all these things going on. I guess kind of two different questions. Do you think having these conversations will make the rest of the world like us more? And then second question is, given all these kind of conflicting priorities that are going on, are you able as a board to put as much attention on some of these issues as you'd like to?
Right. So first answer is I have no idea. My personal view is Canada needs to take a global view rather than a national view on energy, for whatever that's worth. And that means that if you shut down oil and gas in Canada, the demand from the rest of the world is going to keep going up no matter how much we fantasize that it's not. There's too many people and there's too much demand pull. And so then you're getting resources from much riskier jurisdictions. It's really sad. However, I also think that there's a ton of opportunity, and Lori touched on the social side. Vermilion's got some great examples on the social side where I feel like the Canadian energy business or any company, whatever industry you represent in your companies, can do a much better job socially. And I forgot the second part of the question.
Oh, just given that, right now, for some companies, Vermilion's doing pretty good, but for some companies, the focus is on survival. So how much attention can you really give to all of these other areas?
Yeah.
Or is it tied to the survival? See, I'm going all over the place now.
No, it's okay. I just presented in front of a board. They asked me to come in and talk a little bit about ESG just because I happen to know a bunch of the people, and it's a big company, but they're in financial straits, and they're going to have to deal with the reality of what they're dealing with, but they still understand that they've got to push forward on the ESG side and make themselves better. And I'll give you a bit of context, okay? So a guy like me 10, 15, 20 years ago, you sort of say, well, M&A, mergers and acquisitions, it only ever happens to solve a problem for the buyer, okay? And maybe there was 10 items that you might look at and say, okay, well, this guy might buy that guy or whatever. I feel like today, number 11 is ESG elements. And it can be, if you're a debt-strapped company, but you have some wonderful ESG things going on, it might actually make your company more suitable for a buyer. For Vermilion, it's actually the opposite. In other words, Vermilion for 25-ish years has taken on assets that are unloved. And you think about safety and culture and creating a culture of reporting, environmental spills or accidents or whatever, and then rewarding forward-looking leading indicators on safety rather than punishing bad behavior. And suddenly you can take on an asset that is not well stewarded, and you can reduce the spills, you can reduce the CO2 emissions, you can cut your operating costs and extend the reserve life of that asset, and it actually does make the world a better place, okay? So
maybe that can be the new global, you talked about looking at energy on a global scale. Maybe Canada's new slogan can be, we will love the assets better.
Yeah, well, it should be that. Sadly, it's not. Like you look at, I'm going to pick on Shell, just an example, because there's lots of ways ESG can be bad, like really bad. And think about it, right? You got these companies, I don't know, I live in a public world, okay? I don't know where your world is. My public world, you fill out your environmental, your ESG report, and you check a bunch of boxes. And then is the company really, taking this into account in a strategy to create a sustainable advantage? Or Or you look at a Shell, and they dispose of their oil sands assets in Canada, and they also sold a bunch of critically sour gas 6 months ago to a tiny little company. There's, in my opinion, they did that to green their environmental report, and there's no way the people in Alberta are safer because of that transaction. There's no way, in my opinion. And so I look at that, and whether it's Talisman selling out of the Sudan assets years ago, you sell it to the Chinese, is the world really better off because of doing that? I'd say no. And so you gotta be very mindful on these ESG reports, strategy, and what a company is actually doing. And for investors, I speak to a lot of them, I am one of them, you gotta keep a very critical eye out on these CSR reports. And if you're on a board of a company, read that and the ESG report with a skeptical eye, and make sure you are doing the right things as a company. It's a tall order, but it needs to be done more. Is that fair? I tend to ramble a lot. I apologize.
That's great. So we kind of wanted to open it up to the broader group for questions, and you guys can come back up if you like. Hard to see them if you don't. So questions of the group. I've got a few more questions from them as well. But what are you hearing? What are our what are you uncertain about? Patty?
Sure. Just listening because it's kind of focused on the oil and gas sector, and we do have a great industry. We have great environmental standards, etc. But we don't tell the story. And Vermilion's a good example because there's a great project in France that is exceptional. But I bet you, how many in the room know about Vermilion working in France?
Should I educate you?
It's a wonderful story.
Okay, so back in 2008, some smart people at Vermilion teamed up with some smart people in the local community. And then you fast forward to 2017, and you have the French government come out and say exploration and development in France by 2040 is done. 2040, yeah. And so I was just in France meeting with board engagement, okay? You want to meet with employees, locals, politicians, various stakeholders, okay? It's part of a board role. And today, there's 250 people working on this 15-acre beautiful organic greenhouse growing 7,500 tons of tomatoes a year, CO2 emissions cut by 10,000 tons a year using Vermilion waste heat. And you have the, and it's got a shot at doubling, and France can't grow tomatoes competitively with North Africa because they don't have the weather, okay? But these tomatoes they're really yummy, and they're distributed locally the same day they're picked. It's pretty neat. And you have the mayor of the town stand up and say, I'm paraphrasing because I can't speak French like she does, but Vermilion, thank you, please don't ever leave France. We are battling on your behalf with the government, and we will speak positively to the regulators about you. So you think about sustainable competitive advantage. Now, other companies might want to do business with Vermilion. Maybe there's repeatability in the sense of Vermilion's doing all sorts of neat things that don't get advertised, but they're coming. And then you see some of the talent that Vermilion's been able to bring to their French operation because of those types of projects. And suddenly you have hope that there's a great social tie to the energy business, which is labeled as so nasty. And it's a really neat outcome. But it's very hard to do it justice, right? Very hard to do it justice. And is it reflected in the share price? Probably not. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point because just to build on the comment that, even if you have great ESG, will that turn the dial on the global sentiment or general capital sentiment towards the energy industry? And I think that, again, just to echo, that you can do all the right things and it won't because of broader agendas, and it's really hard to shift that mind. But that said, that's just today. It's no less reason to fight the good fight.
Yeah.
And it goes back exactly to your point, which is really telling the Canadian story. I want to build on one other interesting component with that, with natural gas. And within the U.S., of course, as you know, left Paris Accord. And yet they were the only country that would have been on track to meet the targets. And why would they have met those targets?
Yeah, it's because of natural gas.
Because they were using natural gas.
Yeah.
And so our Canadian energy producers that are gas weighted have a huge opportunity when you talk about making the world a better place. Like, is the world better off globally because of these kinds of activities? They would be better off if they could have access to Canadian gas, because it does reduce all of the metrics around emissions and so on. So I think this is an unfortunate area that you can't get credit for making a difference for other countries and organizations that are benefiting from that. But
It's a great point.
yeah.
And would standardization help? So if somebody asked Hans or Hans? Which is it?
I use
Hans, there we go. Somebody asked Hans earlier about standardization, and that's just going through my mind. If there is going to be a global discussion on this, it seems like we would need standardized reporting in this industry and other industries. And I don't know, do you see that on the horizon? Or?
I would like to, because it would make my job a lot easier in terms of evaluating reports. But I think beyond standardization, whether that comes down the pike or not, I think it's up to companies to tell their own ESG story. I mean, the standards tell you one small slice of what you should or could report. It's more important to tell your whole story. And part of I think the Canadian oil and gas industry's problem is that we haven't told a good story. We have a great story to tell, but we don't do it because of whether it's Canadian humility or whether it's just wanting to be polite. It's something that needs to be told. So more important than, I think, standardized approaches to how to report is just, sure, follow those guidelines and report what the rating agencies, the rating or the guideline agencies suggest, but more importantly, tell your story the way you want to, and tell a compelling, meaningful story rather than ticking boxes.
Yeah, I echo that. I think sometimes when you have a standardized framework that everybody has to follow, it does become a routine rote exercise that doesn't allow that innovative, creative way of creating a bit of a competitive advantage with it. But I think that the frameworks that are out there do provide an echo of the standardization.
Could we perhaps present a better case for Canada's energy industry if we explained it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, Vermilion, I think we use 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals in our sustainability reporting, and you look at Suncor and it does as well. But there's a lot of companies, sadly a part of my life is reading these. It's really hard. But a lot of companies don't do that. But you bring up a great point, because you can just pick on a few that are bespoke to your entity's purpose and goals. And then, does everyone know what those are, the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, so yeah, so I think it's a great idea, because it gives you a bit of a framework to at least say, okay, this is who we're going to be, and let's follow that, rather than just shots in the dark, right?
Yeah.
Although you also expressed some concerns, but you were certainly differentiating between sustainability reporting and ESG reporting. So would you have concerns about?
No, not in that context. My differentiation was just companies. So we've had a few clients that have, for example, come to us and said, we've been reporting on sustainability traditionally. We're now calling it an ESG report to help us, make changes. And we're trying to tell them it's not as easy as that. So I'm just, what I was trying to say is that traditional sustainability reporting doesn't cut it for ESG reporting. Yeah.
And you're thinking of the traditional reporting as more being what we're doing.
Exactly what we're doing, all our philanthropy, kind of throw everything at the report and see what sticks. Kind of. But I certainly support the SDG.
Just to follow up, I see this other hand, but I was at a presentation the other day where the city of Calgary was explaining their strategy to go forward under the guidelines of resilience, having departed from sustainability, but yet not attracted to sustainable development goals. And the argument in the room was, well, surely if you have a bigger context, there's lots of room to maneuver. Perhaps Calgary and its energy orientation could actually play a leading role in saying, okay, so here's where we were, here's where we're going, here's how we're getting there, and leadership then would emerge. And it seems that all 3 of your topics, or all 3 of your comments, relate to playing a bigger leadership role, understanding, education, but we don't seem to have the context. And I wonder, how do we make that happen?
It's a great question. I don't know.
We all seem to not know. We're pregnant waiting.
Yeah.
I can say within the energy space, the challenge is that you've got two groups of players. You have the large multinational corporations, which Canada is just a lever, really, you know. So that'd be the Shells and BPs. Something doesn't work here, we just go, we're part of the community when we're here, but there's not that same kind of commitment to understanding how to create a leadership element in Canada. It's not their place to do that. But then you have the intermediate players, the juniors, the intermediate players, and they're kind of like a herd of cats. And so the challenge the story hasn't been told is that they don't know how to consolidate a voice. They're starting to echo that now, that we need to be doing that, we need to be having these conversations, but they just haven't clicked in the best way to do that. It's being done very piecemeal, and I think it's difficult when you have a group of CEOs that are very strong-willed to collaborate. They are collaborative. I don't want to say that they aren't, but to get to the common language, I think, is the challenge. I don't know what you're seeing with that.
Well, you know, there's guys like Mac Van Willigen and Chris Sablicki have gone out and tried to educate the populace. I've written a couple of articles on it, and it's trying to help people understand the hypocrisy behind hating an oil and gas company versus what they do every day. And the length of the transition is going to be long. The technologies don't even exist yet to replace planes or ships and trains. And you know, when you order something on Amazon, you're starting a coal-fired factory in China, and then it gets dieseled all the way over to here, and then custom delivered to your house. Like, are you really sure you understand what you're doing with energy while you go to the protest? Like, do you really understand?
That's right.
And so it's very unfortunate that exists, but it's raising that kind of a mindset so people understand. And if they really want to go against the oil and gas business, they better start changing their behavior really quickly. And I just don't see it.
Robert, you were going to ask a question?
I'd like to ask a bit about the governance part, and if you're, and this is broad, not just energy sector, but, and if you're able to look a little bit, say the for-profit companies and not-for-profit, what are the goals, the standards for governance in the ESG discussion? What are the primary and then what are the indicators of that? What are you aiming for? What are people wanting in terms of governance? What makes a difference? Yes, that's good, or that's not good.
There's a lot behind it, but
Yeah, I would say really there's no difference in terms of what is expected. I mean, good governance is good governance, and you would expect a non-profit organization to have the same governance practices or similar as you would a for-profit. And so I think a lot of the issues under the governance bucket would apply to both for-profit and for non-profit. So just based on principles, I don't make a distinction between the type of organization and the governance structures.
yeah. But what I would say, there are, for example, Report on Business through Globe and Mail puts out annually a report called Board Games, which looks at governance criteria and rates organizations based on that. That's a good place to go and take a look at it. And there's other rating agencies around that, but that tends to be one that for quite some time organizations have taken a look at. And so some just really generic principles would be, if you have board of directors, how many other boards do they sit on? Are they spread too thin? So they'll take a look at that. Governance aspects about CEO compensation and the nature of the compensation. That's considered good governance because that's oversight of the CEO and linking their compensation to performance and within boundaries of some sort. You take a look at governance, like it starts at the various high levels and works its way down to even purchasing practices and governing how an organization manages that, right, around ethics, governance around ethics and how organizations see that play out. Based on the industry, ethics will look so different, right? Energy has a very different type of ethics if you're retail or in the hospitality industry or something like that. But I think that's a good place to go.
Sorry, what was the name of that report?
It's called Board Games.
I don't think they're doing it anymore.
Are they? Did they
I
stop
think they
doing
stopped
that?
doing it,
When did
but
they do that?
They did. I think this is the last year, but you can still look at this
Oh my
year's.
goodness, well there you go.
I think.
If that's,
So
yeah.
look at old version.
And you know, I'm
you
just
can look
going
at
to
an old version.
qualify my recommendation on that. For the record, every executive hates it and thinks it's really terrible, but it's a starting point to think about, right? Yeah.
I think for governance on the comp side, it's just, just recognizing, you guys all know this, but everybody in this room acts to how they get paid.
Yes.
So when you're creating incentives, be really mindful, and it's super hard. You're really mindful of the behavior incentivizing, right? Because it can really go the wrong way. And, you know, the management teams or whatever will play all sorts of games to make things look better than they are. So you gotta be careful with that.
Does Enron come to mind?
Yeah, well, hopefully not in any situation I'm ever involved in, but yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I have two questions. First one, so am I right in, so this right in thinking this environmental, social, and governance evaluation, right? And so with that, I'm wondering, what do you sort of measure it against? Is it like a best practice, and how do organizations know when they are doing well in terms of this environmental, social, governance evaluation or sort of criteria? How do you know, what do you measure it against? Like, how do you know you're doing well? And the second one would be, to what extent has this been, let's say, is this being taught in schools, universities? And 'cause I think it would be great for students to have a good understanding of this, and yeah.
So I would say the first.
Go ahead.
The first part, first question is, what are you measuring against? So the various rating agencies have their own secret sauce, their recipe for how they measure companies. But I would say, like, you know, again, that goes back to what I said before, is don't worry about how you're being measured by the rating agencies. They're going to apply their criteria and their methods to rating your report. Measure yourself against, you know, your peers or yourself. So tell a compelling story that really, you know, gets at the why behind why your organization is doing something in regards to ESG. The ratings are I would say, the ratings are the ratings. It's more important to have kind of the meat behind, you know, the ratings. I don't know, I don't have insight into how the rating agencies do their ratings work, but from my perspective, I mean, obviously we would, when we're asked of our clients, you know, tell us how our report's doing, we would benchmark, you know, we would say, well, here's what we consider to be a leading report, and here are some features, and here's what you're missing, here are some gaps. So we definitely do benchmarking, and also based on experience, what we would like to see in a report is what we would recommend.
I think too, focusing on decision useful, and then material information, and then thinking about the metrics you're using to measure performance. So for CO2, you want to measure it per unit of output, you want to measure it against dollar of revenue, against your peers, and then suddenly you have something that's comparable, right? It's just like being a financial analyst and looking at different financial metrics. It just happens to be a different thing that you're measuring.
To address the university question, in the Canadian context, being the context that I'm the most familiar with, I don't think you're going to find any really business schools anymore that don't focus on some of these things in business ethics type classes. Like all the business schools have business ethics classes. But I think the challenge now for business schools, or the next step for business schools, is that's good to have the business ethics class or the corporate social responsibility class or sustainability class. So we call it different things. But how do we also integrate it in the business strategy class, which is something we're wrestling with here, is, okay, we want to teach standard business strategy, but how do we layer in, and we're figuring it out, you know, how do we layer in these pieces? But as far as other contexts like engineering, you know, or other things that, you know, lead to these, I'm not sure. You guys are probably better than me on that.
I think there's also some frameworks too that organizations can disclose that they're using certain frameworks and things like that that are out there. So, and like I said, I think it's been, you know, you're right. I think most business schools, and I can't speak to other disciplines other than on the ethics side. I think that's kind of across the board. But this has been taught for a long time. Like I said, back in 1993, it was the triple bottom line element and discussions around that. So it's always kind of woven in, and it just continues to build and grow and become clearer.
And hopefully becomes more integral.
Yeah,
as in,
yes.
It's not just sort of this optional thing. So
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and even to take it down under the university level, I'm seeing a lot of curriculum that incorporates, you know, sustainability in elementary, junior high school as well. So just having kids in the kid as well.
We've actually started an initiative through the Soul Forum with the other universities in town, where we being Ambrose, put together
it's really just a newsletter right now called the High School Business Teacher Hub, because there's a whole bunch of high school business electives out there where we're communicating with high school teachers in the city on, hey, there's these resources, there's, well, to get them to talk about this at the high school level or junior high level. But the younger that we can infiltrate them, better. So I'm gonna just formally stop the session. I'm sure you guys will stick around and answer other questions. I just want to keep an eye on time. So next steps. 2:30 this is about a 15-minute break, so there's still some time for individual questions. We're heading back to the gym, final plenary session, and a fellow, actually through one of our relationships with MRU, Sean Leone, is just going to kind of talk about, okay, what do you do now? How do we actually take some of our learning and put it together? There's treats, candy specifically, and probably something healthy too, I'm not sure. Can't guarantee the healthy part, I just listened to the candy part. So that's taking part in the gym at 2:30, and then we'll have everybody out here at 4. But a thank you again to our guests. And then certainly do, I see you.
That presentation.